You're with The Listening Post on Capital Radio, and tonight this is Tony Howes talking with Murray Hall, the author of Walk a War in My Shoes. Now, we heard from you, Murray, about your background and how it happened, how the book came into being. Perhaps if you could give us a setting for whatever you're going to read, that would help.
Certainly. So when I became connected to the letters and started to research a fair bit of it, I had to turn the clock back a little bit further to paint the picture of where this man come from, what the little bit of the family history, and you need to establish that what sort of lifestyle he had leading up to his enlistment, and those sorts of things had to be explained. So that it builds the picture. So he was born into a farming environment in a place called Beech Forest in Victoria. It's a magnificent area of the Otway Ranges, not far from Colac, and it's a magnificent place. It's almost non-existent now, the little town, but it was a logging town, late 1800s, early 1900s, and the family there were pioneers. They moved into the area when all it was forest. They had to cut the forest down to clear a little bit of land so that they could grow a few crops and bring a few cattle in and a few cows there to have some milk and feed themselves and to supply butter to the local butter factory and things like that. So they were on a 313 acre farm in Beech Forest, and I've picked out a little passage for you, and the passage is called Cloverdale. And Cloverdale was the name of the farm at Beech Forest. So there was only the family there on that particular farm. The area is very rugged area. The farm was actually on a little bit of a plateau, so they had a little bit of flat ground at the top, but then the farm dropped away very rapidly on both sides down to rivers, and it was really very solid bush and 300 feet trees all around there, so it was pretty hard going in those early days. So I've got to a point in time where Uncle Ernest's father arrives, and he has to build a cottage to live in. So let me take it from there. When Father built our cottage using the timber from the stockpile he had accumulated, it was still very green, and the shrinkage in the floorboards became an issue when they aged and dried out. Some of the gaps that appeared were up to 3/4 of an inch wide. He would plug them with old newspapers and timber strips that he would hammer through the gaps. Some would be well hidden with a floor rug to cover over, but mostly they were hard to hide. It could be a bit breezy during the winter and hard to hold the heat in. Summer wasn't bad, with a bit of cool air wafting up late in the day. There were a couple of larger holes where tiger snakes had come up through the floorboards, seeking warmth, and Mother had blown their heads off with a shotgun. I believe some of Mum's best cutlery disappeared through the floor gaps over those years. Twin girls were born on the Cloverdale kitchen table. It wouldn't be till many years later that I would learn from my mother that my sisters hadn't survived their birth. My parents' run of misfortune continued when another bushfire went through the area. The house and animals survived, but most of Dad's supply of stock feed and crops were destroyed. This prevented my parents from earning anything from the dairy cows for quite a while. The winter that followed was a very severe one on stock, and half the dairy herd died. Dad wrote to the Crown Land Department seeking an extension of time to pay the rent, which was the lease contract, because of the setbacks and to allow some breathing space. When spring arrived, there was plenty of feed back in the paddocks, and he again purchased more head to replace the ones that had perished. Early in 1899, Mum, brother Frank and I were on the train back to Melbourne to stay with the in-laws, the Trinicks. Baby brother Walter was born in February that year. No more chances with the kitchen table, I guess. We were now a 3-man team, plenty of young, strong lads to help around the farm. Beech Forest Primary School opened in 1901, and I was one of the first children to walk through the door. School was just over a mile from Cloverdale, and those classes were conducted in a room of the Ditchley Park Hotel in the centre of Beech Forest. Mother walked me in for the first week, but I was on my own after that. Walking to school wasn't much fun, knee-deep in mud during the winter and inches of dust in the summer. A mile each way, each day, could be a bit testing. In 1903, the school moved out of the hotel, a few hundred yards further away to a departmental building adjacent to Wilson's store. By that time, Frank was school age, so we walked to school and back home again, rain, hail or shine. In 1906, a fire started in Wilson's store. It spread quickly and destroyed the school and the Anglican church next door. A couple of weeks later, the school reopened in the public hall, which had been built near the road bridge that went over the railway line to Cowes. 50 children attended that year, which included our baby brother Walter. 4 more children would be born into Cloverdale in the following years, all girls, all stillborn. I remember being woken by a commotion in the house one morning and jumping out of bed. Dad was standing near the kitchen opening and very firmly told me that everything was okay and to go back to bed. I cannot imagine the grief my dear mother must have suffered to have lost 6 children. Her heart must surely ache terribly. Father buried the infants in a very holy place in the forest, a sharp, deep gully that ran down the west side of the farm. I spent many hours as a boy walking the area in search of my siblings' gravesite, nestling down in the ferns, eating blackberries that grew in abundance, the gentle trickle of the creek water flowing down through the forest floor, glowworms and fireflies all around me. I would never find the exact position of their resting places. Father had not marked the graves, but he knew where they were, and that's the most important point. At the base of a mountain ash tree that faced back up through the gully, I always felt some sort of connection, a tingling up my spine, boyhood fantasy, or some divine message. I'll never know. Dad came home from town one day with a black pup. He claimed it over a bet and a rum at the Ditchley Park Hotel. At first its name was So Long, because when Mum first saw him she said, "So long, dog," meaning that the dog would keep going. She wasn't all that excited about having an additional mouth to feed around the farm. She would ask my father if the dog's arrival meant he had won the bet or lost it. We never knew if he was any particular breed or not, but there was a bit of Kelpie cattle dog in him from the way he rounded up the sheep and the cows. Black, lean, fast, big brown eyes, and not afraid of work. He was a ripper animal. The name So Long faded out and he would be renamed Dog. We all grew to love that animal very much, and he loved us back. It was as if there were 4 boys in the family. He could do everything except talk. Some days he would walk with us to school, hang around all day and walk home with us. If Dad needed him on the farm, Dad would hold him back until we were out of sight, and Dog would stay with him all day. He worked well with all the other animals and became a valuable member of our farming family. After Mum got over the initial arrival of Dog, he grew on her too. She loved him to bits. If Dog wasn't at school with us or working the farm with Dad, he could be found beside Mum as she worked in the kitchen or at milking the cows or laying in the veggie crop. He was a welcome company to all of us. The 5 of us sat on the veranda one summer night and collectively cried our eyes out when Dog was killed by a tiger snake. The farm ticked over quite well, all the hard work slowly paying off, the stock holdings grew, and a small but steady income was realised. We carried up to 15 dairy cows. They all had names: Millie, Misty, Polly, Annie, etc. And they were all milked by hand. Milk and cream were separated, the cream being carried to the front gate in square milk cans each morning to meet the Colac butter factory cart. A small sample was tested, and around 2 gallons of cream a day would leave Cloverdale. The remaining milk was used for the heifer calves and for Mum's kitchen. Most of it was also used to feed the weaner pigs when we had them. Occasionally Mum would sell butter in town if she was flush with milk and cream, and there were always a few chooks running around that produced a healthy supply of eggs. We didn't own a bull for the cows, but our neighbour had one. We called the neighbour Mr. Neighbour because that was their family's real surname. Dad would walk the cows next door, wait for the bull to service them, and walk them home when the job was done. No money was ever exchanged. The bush worked very well with a barter system. Maybe a heifer calf from the cows next year, or lend a hand sowing a crop, or the loan of equipment would act as payment. The neighbours had a son, Jim, a couple of years older than me. He would often explore the bush on horseback together and would become close mates. Common food for the community was bunnies, bread and milk. Cloverdale was self-sufficient in all of them, plus we grew our own spuds and swedes. Mother made her own bread, and it was occasionally the duty of Frank and I, Wal was a bit young, after we had returned from school, to take the guns out and shoot a rabbit or two for dinner. It was on one such occasion in January 1909, Frank was 12 and I was 13 years old, when bad luck rolled back through the front gate. Frank and I moved away from the house to hunt up some tucker. Father had taught us the first golden rule was to never fire back towards the house or livestock, so we always had the farm at our backs. We were careful with guns. Frank spotted a fox, which would kill our chooks, and to get a better shot, climbed up onto a fallen log. The shotgun latched onto a notch in the log and accidentally fired, shattering Frank's right hand. My screaming alerted Mother and Father, who bolted down through the paddock to find us. Jessie, our horse, had to be caught and harsed into the jinker. She is a flighty thing and hard to catch at the best of times, but I suspect she sensed the tension and fear in the air and obeyed on Father's first instructions. I was terrified, scared, frightened for my brother's life. The blood, the missing hand, I didn't know what to do. I was a spectator, shaking with shock. I did my best to help Dad lock in Jessie, but I felt useless. Everyone was screaming except Wal, who sat on the veranda steps crying. Dad told me to stay put and look after Wal and the farm while he and Mother took off down the driveway and turned left on the track to Beech Forest at full flight. Father on the reins, Mother in the back with Frank. Mum kept Frank alive by holding him face down in the jinker with the remains of his right hand pointing towards the sky, with her rolled up apron wrapped around the stump to hold the blood in. Dad drove flat out into Beech Forest, his son's life depending on it. Hurtling over the bumps in the log road, the jinker was sometimes 4 foot in the air. Jessie excelled. Dad said he had never galloped that fast in all her life. With some good fortune, one of the 2 resident town doctors, Dr. Backhouse, was quickly located and summoned to the post office, where they immediately operated on Frank on the front counter. Frank was extremely weak by the time the doctor arrived. His life was very much in danger due to the large amount of blood he had lost. News flew around town that Frank Hall had shot his hand off, and the locals gathered for a grandstand view through the post office window. It seemed the whole town had turned out to witness the event. Through some act of God or good modern medicine, or maybe a combination of both, Frank survived, but his future as a farmer had taken a severe hit. The shattered remains of his hand were removed at the wrist, leaving him with a stump. Years later, he would have a 2-pronged hook fitted.